In the aftermath of World War II, in which 75 million people were killed, two great powers emerged. Those were the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States represented democracy, while the Soviet Union represented communism. Although they played a crucial role in defeating the Axis powers, the USSR became a rising threat post-World War II as they began gaining control of Eastern Europe. In stark contrast to Soviet communism, the United States and Western European countries explicitly supported democracy. This contrast formed an iron curtain between the West and the East. This led to the era known as the Cold War. The Cold War was a time of intense nuclear tension between the United States and Russia. Both sides were threatening nuclear war and stockpiling their nuclear arsenals. There was multiple close calls in which miscalculation nearly led to nuclear holocaust. Communism goes against the fundamental beliefs of democracy. In a communist state, the government takes full control of all the capital and industry in the country. This is meant to remove economic inequality. However, this idea is seen by democratic countries as empowering tyranny. In communism, the government holds nearly all the power, and this often leads to a corrupt government. While in democracies, such as the US, power lies with the people. It is the exact opposite in communism. Because of the massive differences in ideology, many Western European countries, as well as the United States, saw communism as a threat to democracy. The North Atlantic Treaty Alliance was born from these high tensions. NATO was formed by the United States, Canada, and those Western European countries to provide support against Soviet expansion. The formation of NATO was a turning point in history because it marked a shift towards collective defense, deterred threats from Russia on NATO members, and provided a framework for the United States to contain communism and stabilize Europe. Before the founding of NATO, governments around the world focused more so on individual national security strategies rather than a collective defense approach. This act established the Central Intelligence Agency, merged the War Department and Navy Department into a single entity known as the Department of Defense, and founded the Air Force. The aim of national security was highly focused internally, as opposed to working on alliances and collective defense. This clearly showcases the ideology of individualism when it comes to national security prior to NATO's establishment. Following the outbreak of the Cold War, the idea of US isolationism was firmly rejected in the National Security Council paper NSC 68. It was believed that withdrawing from any sort of confrontation would only result in Soviet domination of Eurasia, causing the US being cut off from valuable European allies and resources. National Security Council paper of 1950 NSC 68 concluded that the sole plausible way in deterring the Soviet Union was to bolster the nuclear arsenal, as well as building up the conventional military. Most relevantly, the United States needed not only to protect the United States from Soviet attacks, but also needs to protect its allies. The formation of NATO was the vessel which the United States was able to use to ensure this goal. The formation of NATO marked the shift away from these individual strategies and towards the collective defense approach. In the decades following its establishment, for example, the United States bolstered focus on alliances. According to Texas National Security Review, Jimmy Carter's National Security Plan in 1977 upheld the importance of NATO. Decades later, in 1982, the Reagan administration prioritized strengthening existing alliances, specifically those within NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Alliance explicitly led to strengthening alliances and a shift in ideology towards collective security against threats, even if those threats were specific to only one of the member states. This shift was explicit in NATO's Article 5. The parties agreed that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that, if such an armed attack occurs, each of them will assist the party or parties. The formation of NATO was a turning point in history in the aspect that it allowed the United States to protect allies and deter threats in ways never seen before. This leads to our next contention. The USSR made a conscious effort to gain influence and control over neighboring countries following the end of World War II. NATO would develop many strategies to neutralize this threat. NATO used nuclear deterrence, military presence, exercises, and enhanced forward presence, as well as the previously mentioned strategy of collective defense. This was crucial in deterring Russian aggression on NATO states. Amidst the stockpiling of nuclear weapons by the US and USSR during the Cold War, NATO threatened the use of their arsenal, which was used to deter attacks and invasion of vulnerable neutral countries. The last two common strategies poised to be more recently used are military presence and enhanced forward presence. These two strategies were used to show the Soviet Union that they had the means to protect their allies. These strategies also play a role in collective defense due to its strengthening allied countries. According to Allied Land Command, enhanced forward presence is battalion-sized battle groups which will be robust, multinational, combat-ready forces demonstrating the strength of the transatlantic bond and making clear that an attack on one ally would be considered an attack on the whole alliance. These two strategies ultimately showed the Soviet Union that NATO was militaristic and ready to protect allied countries. The formation of NATO was a turning point in history because it allowed countries to employ strategies needed to deter threats from countries such as the Soviet Union. These newfound strategies used by NATO were essential in protecting US allies and maintaining national security. The United States wasn't just focused on maintaining national security. Another important goal was to stabilize Europe and contain communism. NATO offered the United States a framework to contain communism and stabilize Europe during the Cold War. While the United States was a founding member of NATO and aimed to deter Russia, the United States government also wanted to utilize NATO to help rebuild Europe after the devastating World War II. The current president after World War II was the Honorable President Truman. Truman made two main documents that highly impacted Europe. These two documents are the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. The Marshall Plan mainly focused on stabilizing the economy and the building efforts in Europe, while the Truman Doctrine focused on preventing the further spread of communism to vulnerable countries. President Truman used NATO as a crucial vessel to operationalize the goals of the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan. Firstly, the collective defense mechanism was essential as it aligned with principles outlined in the Truman Doctrine. NATO provided the necessary framework to fulfill the US commitment to supporting the European nations. This is because of NATO's unique ability to have worldwide unified military to respond to any active threats. Secondly, the unprecedented military and political coordination seen by NATO states facilitated the implementation of diplomatic, economic, and military measures used to counter the Soviet Union threat. This related to the Truman Doctrine as these economic and military goals found practical application within NATO's framework. There were two significant impacts to the way the United States used NATO as a vessel to help reach the Marshall Plan. While the Marshall Plan and NATO were separate initiatives within distinctive purposes, they both helped achieve similar goals that facilitated the successful implementation of the Marshall Plan. Firstly, security and economic stability. NATO laid the foundation for the Marshall Plan. NATO created a security umbrella for Western European nations. Article 5 security assurance created a good environment for economic recovery. A stable and secure Europe was more likely to attract foreign investments and trade, which were essential components of the Marshall Plan. Lastly, coordination of efforts. The existence of NATO helps coordinate military and economic efforts among Western nations. This coordination between military and economic initiatives helped create an approach to rebuilding Western Europe and eventually completing the Marshall Plan. The formation of NATO was a turning point in history because it marked a shift towards collective defense, created a system of deterrence never seen before, and provided a framework for the United States to contain communism and stabilize Europe.